And now there's been a lot of mudslinging going on in the Timothy Busfield case. And many people are asking, is this okay? And why were Busfield's lawyers permitted at Busfield's detention hearing to present evidence to the judge regarding the bad acts of the father of one of the accusers? What does that have to do with the accuser? And isn't that just victim shaming? And those are very deep questions. The short answer is the rules of evidence that would apply at a trial do not apply at the pre-trial detention hearing. At that hearing, it's only to determine whether there are appropriate conditions on which the defendant can be released from custody pending a trial. It's not to decide the ultimate issue of the case. But that leads us into what is going to be, I think, upcoming some very interesting battles regarding to what extent, if any at all, can evidence of the father of one of the accusers criminal misconduct and the fact that he's a disbarred attorney, will that go in front of the jury? Will a jury be able to hear that? So when I have cases, I like to make a little bit of a checklist. Some attorneys like to make a flow chart. Personally, the way I visualize things, a checklist is easier for me to follow. And there are certain rules of when things can be heard by a jury and when they cannot be. Similar to football, a quarterback can only throw from behind the line of scrimmage. You cannot throw the ball from out of bounds. To get a first down, you need to advance 10 yards, right? So the same way you have rules for football, you have rules for a trial, and the judge acts as the referee, and the judge says what's appropriate to come into evidence and what's not appropriate to come into evidence. And the first big area, which I think we're going to see a big battle for, is what's called relevance. The prosecution is going to argue that this evidence of the father's misconduct should be kept out because it's irrelevant, meaning the mere fact that the father did these bad things does not mean that the child is not being truthful in what he said, and does not mean that Busfield did not do what he's accused of doing. It reminds me of a case I had where we were suing these large banks for just complete incompetence, gross negligence, which cost my client many, many millions of dollars. The unfortunate aspect was this individual who we were representing had also had separately his own financial troubles. And if you Googled him, it was all over the news. You Google Bob Smith, and all these things would come up on Google about this financial misconduct that he had been involved with. And the banks were saying, aha, he did all these bad things then. It must be he also did it now. And our argument was that's irrelevant. If you want to allege that he did something wrong, you have to show evidence of it. Proof, the mere fact that he did something before doesn't mean that he did this thing too, right? The mere fact that you forgot to take out the garbage last night does not mean that you're not going to wash the dishes tonight. And when your wife yells at you for watching TV before washing the dishes because you didn't take out the garbage last night, well, you can say to her, honey, it's irrelevant. If we were at trial, your evidence of me not taking out the garbage last night would not be admissible. Unfortunately, I don't think many people's spouses operate the same way as judges do in a court of law, but it would be worth the argument anyway. So where am I going with this? What I think is going to happen, here's where I see it going. defense is going to say that it's relevant to show that the father perhaps had a motive or some kind of bias against Busfield or motive for, for encouraging his child to make things up. And it may not be relevant to prove that the child made it up or didn't make it up, or the child was lying or not lying, but it could go to the weight of a possible motive that the father is trying to maybe, get in the news or get a payday against Busfield because he's in so much financial trouble, and he sees this as an avenue to escape his own financial troubles by turning the spotlight onto Busfield. And does that prove that the child is lying? No, but it goes towards the weight. And that's where I see a judge possibly coming out. Again, the motions have not yet been filed. I think this was going to be very interesting. And, we're going to break it down once that all happens. But here's the other big thing that I see. And in case you didn't already, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And again, let me know in the comments what you think of where things are going. But the second big category that I want to address is what's called impeachment. And no, it does not mean impeaching like Bill Clinton or Donald Trump got impeached. No, it's something completely separate. Impeachment means the credibility of a witness. So if a witness gets up there and says, well, I think that the sky is blue, and you say, well, you're not believable because yesterday you said that the earth was flat, therefore we know you're crazy. So how can I believe you now when you say the sky is blue? So in Busfield's case, what they're going to say is, well, how can you believe the father that he's telling the truth? He's a bad guy. He did all these crimes beforehand. And we're going to impeach him and say, you can't believe what he says because he has his felony for conviction and therefore he's a liar. Now, that doesn't mean that the evidence or the father cannot testify at trial. It just means that the jury is going to hear also about this fraud conviction. And now they have to decide, does this fraud conviction make him so unbelievable that therefore we're going to completely discount what he said? And that goes to the weight of the evidence, which is the domain of the jury. But that's where I see the battle happening. And these are going to take the forms of what's called a motion in limine. A motion in limine is motions that are filed before trial where you are trying to shape the game and shape the landscape before trial, where you're saying, this is what I want to introduce into evidence. And the other side will say, no, this should not go into evidence. Or, okay, maybe this can go into evidence, but not this. And you're going to have the defense saying, well, if the prosecution calls the victim's father, Mr. X, and he testifies as to why, then we're going to bring in this ABC about this fraud conviction. And that's where you'll see the battle lines starting to be drawn. So that's a quick synopsis of where I think this is headed on Busfield. Let me know what you guys think. It's troubling, for sure it's troubling. I don't like the fact that if he's telling the truth, then now, if the father is telling the truth, then now all his dirty laundry is being aired. But unfortunately, that's the tension, because there are people who make things up, and I see it every day. I see it all the time. And it may not be the case with Busfield, with the parents of this accuser. And it's an unfortunate reality that that is what has to happen. And the law, unfortunately, cannot cover every gap. And it is absolutely, I think, a deterrent sometimes for people coming forward. But there's always that balance in law. There's always that tension, protecting people's rights versus the truth and justice. And the law has to try to balance the two. And that's why the judge is going to have to make some tough rulings about what extent it's going to come in and what extent it won't come in. In terms of things outside of court and just leaking it to the press, it's not so much the domain of the court. There's free speech in this country, and it has its pros and it has its cons. And we can all have scholarly debates about free speech and what extent it's good or bad, but the judges look to the law. So that's it for now. You guys let me know what you think. Please drop a comment below, like, comment, subscribe, and until next time, we'll see everybody later.